Well, good morning and welcome to an FS Club webinar. And today it's about difficult questions, saving management consultancy from itself. And I'm delighted to have here Nick Bush, who's the director of the Center for Management Consulting Excellence. And I have had a small role working with Nick and a group of other people on exactly these difficult questions. Now, you know me, I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien. And I am able to provide introductions to so many wonderful webinars only because of the widespread interest and tolerance of our sponsors. Our sponsors do let us range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And wherever you go in that area, you'll find a management consultant, that's for sure. And today we're going to be exploring, what is management consultancy, what value does it add, but actually, how can the profession up its game? And yet not in a critical way, or not in a nasty critical way, but in a positively critical way, by asking itself the difficult questions that it might well ask its clients. Now, just before we get cracking, as you know, my job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible. Nick's going to be speaking for about 20 minutes. He's got a couple of polls as well, so keep your fingers on the buzzers, please, folks. But we have a lot of time for Q&A, 20 minutes or so. And whilst I'm conscious that all of us have stories we'd love to share about consultants, they'd love to tell us, to borrow our watches to tell us the time and all the old jokes. Nevertheless, there are some deep and very serious questions that Nick is posing, and I know that our crowd will engage with them. So Nick, with no further ado, may I hand you the floor? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and I'd like to kick off by launching the two polls. One is to get a gauge of whether which choir I'm preaching to, whether you're a practicing management consultant or have been in the past, whether you're somebody who hires management consultants or neither of the above. So you have what I would refer to as a proper job.
Well, there you go. And they've already, about half of them, no, 3/4 have already answered it. We'll leave it open for just a couple more seconds, Nick, to get most people in. Virtually 90%. That's great. And we'll just have a quick look at the results there. So
right. So definitely preaching to the choir today. So, excellent. Good. And can we have the second poll, which will become, the reason for it will become apparent in a moment. So I have two sons, currently aged 25 and 33. Please guess how many of them work as management consultants, given that professions are often handed down from parents to...
Would the answer change if it were two daughters, or? All right, well, over 80...
No, I only have two sons, there are no other.
All right, well, over 90% have voted. We'll just have a quick look at those results as well.
Right, very interesting. Okay, well, we'll have to hang on to that one. Okay. But if I can have the first slide up, please. Yeah, just a brief introduction, because I'm aware that the Center for Management Consulting Excellence is not really a household name, not even a household name in its own household. In fact, we probably don't really have a household, because it would be better described as a network these days, an open and professional collaborative community to assess and share leading and emerging practices in management consulting. And we do the kind of things that you would expect an organization like that to do. We've produced reports in the past. I'll talk a little bit about those later on. We run events, and we kind of stimulate discussion on what we see as the kind of emerging forces and leading in practices, not just for practicing management consultants, but also for the clients of management consultants. Because if consultancy can't add value to its clients and improve the ability to add value, then it really doesn't have a purpose. And some of the kind of why we do this is that management consulting is thriving, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And there are times when it delivers excellent value to its clients. But, there's always a but, it does, I think, currently contain seeds of its own potential demise. And in order to do that, it needs to respond to some of the external threats and potentially some internal forces as well. And in order to address that, it should start to address some challenging questions, which we will hopefully start to unpack in the next 20 minutes. So if I can have the next slide. This is my eldest son, Tom, at the age of about 6. I didn't have a date for this photo, but you can see by the quality of the computer that he's playing with that it was obviously about 25 or so years ago. And around about that time, I was working on a transformation project for a client in Oslo. And one of the advantages of working abroad was that occasionally you could bring your family over for the weekend. And one weekend, Tom and my wife were traveling from the airport in Oslo in the bus, and my wife saw a hoarding with the logo of the company I was working for, my client, and she said, "Oh, look, that's who Dad's working for at the moment." And Tom sort of turned to her and said, "Yeah, well, what exactly is it that Dad does?" He always had an inquiring mind, still does. And she thought for a moment, how do you explain management consulting to a 6-year-old? And she said, well, he helps people to do their jobs better. To which Tom immediately snorted and replied, well, that's not much of a job, is it? And I think if we go to the next slide, we can see some of the reasons why he might have had that view and why people probably may continue to have that view. Thinking back over the last couple of years that we've been through, I don't saw a lot of signs with rainbows thanking the NHS for everything they've done during the pandemic. I didn't see one that said management consultants. And even though management consultants did do some pretty good work. In fact, the worshipful company of management consultants, of which I'm a member, and Michael is an honorary liveryman, awarded its annual prize back in 2020 to Accenture for the work that they've done on rolling out ventilators. I think assembled a project extremely quickly and done some great work. However, what we did see is headlines around consultancies winning massive contracts in a COVID spending spree, and the defence of £7,000 a day rates for test and trace consultants. That number varied between 6,000 and 7,000 a day, and presumably referred to partners who would be spending probably a couple of minutes talking to the client. So it didn't really represent the everyday fees that consultants were getting, I would suggest. And we also saw other more globally headlines around McKinsey's, who I don't think have a cure for cancer practice, and I don't think any of the other Big Four consultants have a world peace practice. And maybe if they did, we would perhaps see more favourable publicity for headlines. But McKinsey, as many people are aware, did feed into the opioid crisis. They've paid a fine for that, and this headline that I discovered yesterday shows that they could actually have an interest in a company that treats people with opioid addiction. So it's good to know that they're covering all aspects of that supply chain. The little photograph in the bottom left-hand corner is a photograph of the lovely livery hall for the tallow chandlers. Now, the tallow chandlers is a livery company formed in about the, I think, 16th century, or possibly even earlier than that, to make tallow candles for all the people who had a business making tallow candles. Now, even though we're facing a tremendous energy crisis at the moment, I don't think we're going to be going back to using tallow candles in any major way. In fact, I think, you probably can't see it on the screen, but I think those are actually wax candles on the table. There's also a wax chandler's livery company, but the use of candles is not massively widespread. As I've mentioned earlier, the management consultants also have a livery company. We don't have a grand hall. In fact, we don't have a hall at all. We just lodge in other people's livery halls. But I am a bit concerned that, like wax chandlers and tallow chandlers, maybe in 100 years' time or so, we might be asking, what was it that management consultants did exactly? So anyway, let's get on to the next slide and look a little bit at some of the strengths of the consulting industry at the moment. You'll notice this is the kind of slide that consultants do come out with, that has a little bit of sort of moderately flashy graphics that are supposed to give you some kind of information. So the information I'm trying to get across in this is that the consultancy industry in the UK, and these figures come from the Management Consultancies Association, was worth 12.5 billion in 2021. In 2021, it grew by 16%, and it's forecast to grow by 13% in 2022. According to the MCA, in their last survey of clients, then 81% of their clients said that the consultants they'd employed met or exceeded their expectations. It didn't say very much about the reaction of the 20%, My particular practice interests are in the area of customer experience and complaints, and I always feel that it's looking at the 20% who are disaffected that tells you where the real improvements lie. But that's the topic of another presentation. And then consulting remains a very popular destination for graduates. One recruiter definitely put it in the top 10 of things. Excuse me, somebody's just signed out of my Zoom account. Let me just get rid of that. Thank you. And it remains a popular destination for graduates because it offers, I think, a reasonable amount of reward and lots of varied and interesting work, possibly the opportunity to travel and the opportunity to be in lots of very high stress situations a lot of the time. So that's all good, but there are potential weaknesses. If we can move on to the next slide, thank you. And we held a seminar with a writer and former consultant, David Shaw, back in February. And David he'd received a prize from our annual research awards about a year before for a paper that he did on Aristotle and consulting. And his particular area of interest is the rather esoteric sounding link between ancient Greek philosophers and management consulting. And having enjoyed his presentation for an hour, I can tell you that it is a lot more relevant than that rather esoteric title might suggest. But one of the things that he said, which I thought was particularly useful, was that management consulting's work is not really subject to scientific analysis. It doesn't really stand up. A lot of it is about kind of impression management, internal politics, and so on, and relationships, and therefore can be seen as somewhat intangible. So whilst we can point to results, it might be rather hard to actually put a value on those, and that's something I think that does definitely need to be unpacked. And also some of its advice could be a little bit self-interested. It's one thing to do an objective feasibility study of something that a client wants to do. It's another thing to actually partner with them to implement that or provide the IT platform or the resources to manage that going forward. What's the boundary, and where should you stand from an ethical and professional viewpoint? Secondly, I think that whilst it's currently a popular destination for graduates, the forces that have shifted over the last couple of years have caused people entering careers to think, do they really want to work for a firm that may offer them great rewards, but have they used that experience of more virtual working, more kind of networked means of operation to consider how the world of work is going to change? And again, that's another initiative that we've been running in the centre to try and gauge the opinion of that next generation of consultants. And secondly, or finally, I think there are kind of external forces that will impact very much the nature of consulting going forward. I was on a webinar last week with somebody from UiPath, who, if you don't know, are the providers of process automation and artificial intelligence-based software, and one of the leaders in that area. And they were talking about the rise in the next 5 to 10 years of the autonomous organization, a little bit, if you like a self-drive car, but for a business. And that may be fanciful, but I do believe that we'll start to see parts of organizations that will be so automated that they could be said to be largely self-driving. And I know that consultancies, certainly the major ones, are very interested in providing those kind of services to help their clients achieve that. But if you think about the things that process automation does really well, which is take lots of data, analyze it, and produce and infer some results and present them to the user, then that is the kind of thing that consultancies do. And we are already starting to see automation of some of those basic entry-level tasks around data analysis that historically have been done by people en masse over the years. I was on talking to somebody from EY recently and asked her that direct question. Were they seeing the erosion of some of those entry-level tasks? And certainly in their more transaction-based, probably their kind of outsourced type operations, they are definitely seeing that. So it's not too fanciful to think that there might be autonomous consultants, robot consultants, if you will, in the next few years, and those will be apps that clients will simply plug in, or whatever they do, in 5 to 10 years time. So the large battalions of high fee-earning consultants may begin to disappear unless consultancies start to rethink the way they operate. So if we can move to the next slide. So what do we do in the centre to talk about this? Michael's already mentioned that he's been involved in helping us formulate our strategy and approach. And he said, introduced to me, because I'm not really a mathematical historian or even a mathematician, that the idea of the Hilbert problems would be something we could start to frame our inquiry around. For those of you who don't know, very briefly, David Hilbert was a German mathematician who, in the turn of the last century, produced a list of 23 then unsolved problems in mathematics. And that's initiated 120 years worth of, and counting, as I think it's around 8 or 9 of them still remain unsolved. So we thought, what if there are an analogous set of really difficult questions or problems that are perennial ones that beset the management consulting world? As I started to describe it, I made a slip of the tongue and started to refer to them as Dilbert problems, and realized that somewhere in my subconscious, I was thinking that, well, Hilbert is probably the kind of conceptual framework, but the real world where we're seeking to apply them is very much the world of Scott Adams' Dilbert cartoons, a world of toxic bosses, disaffected and disgruntled employees, and Catbert, the evil HR director. I'm sure some of us will know that this is true, although I have to say I've never met a cat that is particularly evil. So it's really understanding this grayer world of organizations and people where we seek to apply perhaps a rather formal approach. And let's move on to the next slide and start to unpack what that is. We didn't convene a conference of great mathematicians as Hilbert did, but we did ask around through our various contacts to understand what some of these difficult questions might be. And as is my wont, I'm put them into 5 different buckets. Firstly, around the boundaries of what is and isn't consulting. I've already alluded to the fact that large consultancies do a lot of delivery and outsourcing. There's nothing wrong with that, but perhaps we need to understand better the boundaries between the two and the different behaviors and standards that might apply in those different areas of consulting. And that takes us to the area of client relationships. How do we manage those in a professional and ethical and suitably distanced way to be effective? I've already talked about delivery and the role of automation. We definitely need to inquire and understand how that will pan out in the next few years. And as would befit a Centre for Management Consulting Excellence, we really do need to crack the question of what is consulting excellence. Again, some work's been done on that already by the Institute of Management Consulting and the Management Consultancies Association, but I think much more exploration of that is needed. And at the centre of it is an understanding of ethics and professional standards, which I think needs to be much higher up the agenda of what consultants do. So some of you by now might be thinking, he hasn't actually asked any questions yet, so where are these difficult questions? So let's go on to the next slide and I'll start to unpack some of these areas very briefly. In the area of relationships and boundaries, we've started within the centre to do quite a bit of work on this. Particularly looking at consulting from a buyer's perspective. And the second report we produced looked at how clients might maximize the value from their management consultants. And one of the things that we found in this is that the relationship, certainly, between clients and consultants changes over the course of the procurement cycle. So very often, what we found was that what was specified in the original spec, where clients go out to tender, is not what they ended up valuing once the work had been completed. And typically, the thing that was most valued was the knowledge transfer from the consultant into the client to enable them to carry on and implement. So it is important to understand how you buy consultancy effectively, how you identify the value that you want from your consultant, and how those boundaries are negotiated as the work progresses. We held a launch webinar about a year ago to discuss this report, and involved somebody called Paul Vincent, who's at the time was working with Hayes on large-scale procurement of consultants and contractors for their clients. And he's now with Randstad, doing a similar kind of thing. And he very cleverly articulated the different kinds of problems that clients would have. Firstly, where were they in their industry? In which case, you need help to kind of from an expert to find out, and perhaps inject a bit of creative thinking. What do they then do about that situation, which requires help or may require help to create a strategy or plan? And how do they do what they need to do once they know what the strategy is, which is where you start to require some help with execution. And if you don't have the capability to execute, that's where you need the expert bodies to come in. I was going to say boots on the ground, but these days it's not really boots, and there's not really a ground that people would come in on. And then there's probably a fifth category of risk assessment and audit to find out how likely your likelihood of success with a project. So there's some of the things we're starting to unpack in that area. And if I can move on quickly to the next slide, because I'm conscious of time, with the watch which I didn't borrow, it's my own watch. Sorry, that was even repeating a joke, which is a terrible thing to do. So professionalization, one of the things that struck me is, in addition to the sort of ethical issues that I talked about earlier, is that professionals have agreed standards of conduct, they have certification, they have qualifications and a route to obtain them, they have professional development pathways once they've become qualified, and there's often an underpinning of research in the profession's subject areas. And very often an ombudsman or an independent complaints process that will support people who are unhappy with the service they've received. And if you think about, particularly in the medical area, osteopaths, doctors, surgeons, whatever, then there are those kind of things that are associated with them. Even in my wife's area, she's an antenatal teacher, and she managed qualifications and educated other antenatal teachers to become certified, and every year she has to get her license to practice as a teacher for the NCT. So organizations can organize these things even if there isn't a sort of public domain degree of standardization. But how do these relate to consultancy? You might say that a certification or a license to practice is actually a barrier to entry for younger people who might bring fresh thinking into an organization. But on the other hand, it provides a degree of assurance. Outside my building at the moment, I have a sign up for somebody who's doing some work on my roof that says he's a member of the Federation of Master Builders. So it does give me a certain amount of assurance that if something goes wrong, I've got somebody I can then refer to. Consulting doesn't really have that at the moment, but should it? Let's move on to the next area, and excellence in consulting. I kind of think that if we'd called the centre something like the Centre for Just About Doing Okay in Consulting, my life might have been a bit easier. But if we go with excellence in consulting, which indeed we should, we can ask questions about, is it really possible to evaluate the performance of a management consultant effectively? You know, and what grade are they when you hire them? Are they any good or not? One of the people I spoke to when I was doing a bit of research around these areas, he said, well, how do we know? And he was a consultant and an ex-partner in a large consultancy. He said, you know, how do we know that when we put the CV in on the proposal that a consultant is, you know, good at strategy or just okay at strategy? So should standardized methods have a greater role in delivering management consulting services? I know they exist. There are change management and project management certifications that are well known, but do they actually add any value? And then what's the dependency between client relationships and excellent consulting? I know from my experience as a consultant, your ability to manage the internal politics and the good relationships, working relationships between yourself and your immediate client is absolutely fundamental to the success of a consulting project, and also being hired again, which is always good. So let's move on to the final, more or less final slide. Just to summarize the kinds of work that we're doing and the next steps on this. I'm conscious that I'm kind of presenting to you a work in progress rather than a finished result. So we are looking at the relationship between the world of academia and consulting, and our latest report is entitled What Management Consultants Want from Academics. We want to build better relationships between research and practice, because the conclusion I think we found from that report is that what management consultants want from academics is kind of not very much, really, but we believe there is more fruitful ground to be explored, to perhaps to bring a degree of rigor and I hesitate to use the word scientific, but at least more rigorous analysis of consulting value and consulting outputs. And within the British Academy of Management, which some of my CMC colleagues are heavily involved in, a consultancy network has been set up to discuss and evolve this thinking. We are kicking off some working groups. We have a roundtable on excellence in consulting happening in, I think it's the second week in June. We've already got an academic lined up for that, and some practitioners and people who've put their hand up from our network of 500 plus people in the CMCE who said, yes, I'd like to actually get together and work through this problem with you. And I've also mentioned something we've been running since the beginning of the year, which is tapping into people who are considering a career in consulting or in their early years of consulting, what we call the next gen around the post-pandemic world of work. So finally, I think, next slide, just to summarize. Yes, I think management consultancy is thriving. It's got many strengths, but the seeds of its own demise include a really sketchy definition of the value it adds. I did recently come across an excellent piece of research from Source Global Research that starts that debate, and I'm very keen on examining that a little bit further and unpacking that. And there's definitely a lack of widespread professional and ethical standards at the moment, but in my latest bulletin from the Management Consultancies Association, it reports great progress in the big firms in their chartered management consultant status, which is a joint initiative with the Institute of Consulting. I do believe new technology is a significant threat. You could say that almost to any industry, I guess, but particularly for management consulting. And one of the ways in which we can address this is to explore and identify, throw up some difficult questions to ensure we are suitably self-critical, to that the profession will continue to thrive rather than die out like other ancient professions. And I guess you'd like to know the answer to the poll question. If I can have the next slide, this will give you a bit of a clue. Dave, my 25-year-old, obviously wasn't around when I had my critique from my eldest son. He has gone on not to a career in consulting. This is actually his main job as a professional musician. Although I have to say he has to find other ways of supplementing his income since he's chosen a path along very much to my pleasure, as I'm a great lover of modern jazz. Clearly that was a bigger influence on him than my role as a management consultant. And Tom did not go on to become a man-eating plant, and this isn't him as a consultant in fancy dress. It has been known for consultants to dress up occasionally, but he's a teacher in an East London comprehensive, again, a music teacher, so music was a very much stronger influence than consulting in my household. And this is a scene from one of his productions. He's not behind the plant, but he was off to the side playing saxophone in the orchestra. So I realize it's a hostage to fortune to call anything difficult questions, but Michael, I've not been keeping an eye on the chat, so I've no idea what's been coming in. Perhaps you can pick out some easy ones to start with.
Well, Nick, thank you very much for that. It's an interesting expose, and in fact, a very honest, open kimono one. I should probably point out I happen to be a chartered management consultant, which is an odd thing. And some of these qualifications we've been struggling with for some time. There was a sort of an amusing private eye cartoon last week, which ran along the lines of our MPs don't need a pay rise, just clap instead. And I think there are quite a few people who might say that about management consultants, but they'd also say that about lawyers. They'd also say about quite a few other professions. So I think it's good that CMC is leading this challenge. Now we've got quite a few comments and questions. So what I was going to do is, particularly, I was going to ask if we could go back to slide 23, the excellence in consulting slide. Thank you very much, Peter. Peter's on top of that. Because I think these three questions do frame the debate very well, and maybe with the audience we could explore which one of these three you would put some of these comments in. So I'll start with one from Bob McDowell. Does management consultancy set business trends and innovation, or does it follow them? So an interesting problem here, I think, does the profession have an obligation to be thinking ahead for its clients, I think is implicit in that comment from Bob.
I cut my teeth in consulting, or seriously cut my teeth in the world of business process reengineering. I worked for a company that claimed to have invented it, influenced by the work of Michael Hammer. So in that sense, we were, I think, definitely positioned ourselves as leading the client and trying to take them to a place that they'd not been in before in terms of considering their business. With the benefit of 25 plus years of hindsight, I'm not sure how much of that was the right kind of surgery for the situations they were in, and whether more established methods at the time of continuous improvement and perhaps a more, I wouldn't say less confrontational, because I don't think we were particularly confrontational in our approach, but you would very much, if you were going in with a radical change viewpoint, you would encounter much more resistance, as you might expect. And whilst that kind of dialectic, if you like, between the kind of radical changes and the resistors of change, I hesitate to say conservatives, but I say conservatives, I mean it with a small c, obviously, it is one that can be unproductive, but you can also get a lot from it by listening to what the people who are resisting change are really on about. So that's my own personal experience. I think one of the values that consultancies have is that they kind of tend to be staffed by people who are particularly interested in the future of work generally, and therefore will start to project ideas onto how work might evolve. But again, I think nowadays that needs to be tempered by thinking about what it is, where is the client really, and what is their situation, what's likely to be possible for them, rather than what might be an idealized view of some future that we've thought up on a Friday afternoon, I guess.
Graham Elliott is curious, how common is it, in your opinion, for a board to commission a management consultancy report to give backing to decisions already made? I'll start there, but there's a second half to the question.
That's in my experience. Actually, I think most of the times when I've been working for a board, they genuinely wanted the answer to a question rather than backing. But I also know that as you go through the process, it's not kind of big reveal and then they go yes, either yes or no. You're kind of discussing it, and ideally it's no shock to anyone when you come up with your conclusions and you've got the buy-in. So it's a grayer process. And the second part of the question was,
well, there's a bit of a sting in the second bit. So in the cases where they are giving backing to a decision already made, do the management consultants provide that backing without sufficient objectivity and regard for the opposite view?
That is an extremely good question. I suppose I then I had an interlude in my consulting career, if you can call it a career, where I went to work for BT and spent a lot of time producing business cases for various initiatives. So it was kind of internal consulting role in a way. And one of the things that you do in the business case is you have the kind of do nothing option as a way of comparing it. So yeah, it kind of depends. I don't think you can generalize necessarily to say that consultants have an interest. I think it's very important to understand if they do have an interest. So again, if you're at the early part and you say, yes, XYZ client should develop a completely autonomous division, and then go, oh, and by the way, Acme Consulting can supply the people to build that division and then run it for you at an annual cost of X, then clearly you've got to recognize the interest there. And you may be fine with that.
Interesting comment here from Simon Hudson, questioning the standards, and I think quite intellectually so. So Simon says, isn't the issue with framing professional standards down to the reality that ultimately management consultants need to deliver fit for purpose, right-sized solutions rather than standardized solutions? which reinforce the sausage machine body shopping badges that is stuck to a number of consultancy firms. And of course, each client journey starts and probably ends at a place unique to them.
Yes, I would tend to agree with that, is the short answer. You do, ultimately, you're responding to a set of needs. As I pointed out earlier, we found from some of our research that people, there's a mismatch between what people want and what they value when as the assignment unfolds. But yes, methods and standards are useful to provide sort of replicable behaviors and things. And I know when I've worked as an associate, where you've kind of assembled a team, if you don't have that common language, it can be quite difficult, and then it's harder to present a quality solution to the client.
Harvey Wade, I think, manages to combine, in some sense, both the relationship type question you had earlier with good, hard-nosed, practical advice. How do you move the conversation with clients from day rates to value pricing? And he'd love to hear your perspective.
I think the short answer is that's an area for further explanation, because I don't know the answer. I did a great project for a client, at least I thought it was a great project. It was years ago. I think it was before I went to Oslo. I was in Austria. I think that in itself was fun, to build a kind of a re-engineered organization, product development organization, and everybody loved it. It went really well, but we felt we were being quite inventive, or at least the person in charge of the original proposal thought he was being quite inventive by saying you can have 25%, we'll hold that back in terms of the fee, depending on whether you're delighted or not. And by the time he got around to discussing with it, the situation had changed so much that I'm not sure, and also the client he was dealing with had changed. He was dealing with someone who was quite hard-nosed, who thought, well, I've got an opportunity to discount the fees here, despite the fact it had delivered everything they wanted. So it is a really, really tricky one, I think. If you can price off, you have to start off and saying, well, this is the value to you, it's X, and maybe you could solve it in an afternoon. I don't know. And the question is, if you do it in an afternoon rather than 6 months with a team of 10.
Angel Gaviera has an interesting one. There have been echoes of this over the years. It's really got to do with some sort of assertion, typically in the financial audits, that management have got a clue about what they're doing, either governance or strategy. There was a time, I think in the last decade, when somebody was proposing that business models ought to be audited and stated in the accounts. A lot of this flits in and out. But from Angel Gaviera, regarding management strategy, should boards embrace strategy audits to complement a financial audit and demand a direct reporting from a well-organized strategy function? And I guess implicit in Angel's comment here is, would the management consultants be the people to do such a strategy audit?
Potentially, yes. I also have a number of colleagues in the centre and in the workshop company management consultant who do board audits, and I'd probably need to ask them whether that kind of strategy evaluation is something that they would do. But there are some people who work in perhaps a hybrid way between that board auditing and strategy evaluation. But yeah, I mean, I think it's good. I think we spent some time working with one of my CMC colleagues, who's kind of an internal consultant, to help us develop a strategy or refine the strategy, which is one of the first things I did a year or so ago when I started as director. And I think it's not so much whether you've got a strategy that looks good, it's whether you're prepared to implement it and question it and review it. And in a sense, that is kind of the domain of a board audit, because what you're doing in a board audit or evaluation is evaluating the dialogue that takes place around the board table. That's more important rather than the substance of the strategy.
There's a comment here from Bob Garrett that I just can't resist reading out. I had lunch yesterday with a 30-year-old high net worth Korean investor who's pulling out of California, disillusioned with the hype. He's moving to London as he sees it as increasingly the world center of sound advice, especially in the 55-plus-year-olds. Is the center exploring this, and is 80 the new 55? Well done, Bob, who I think is on my side of 55 as well. But yeah, good comment there about where do you get sound advice. But I'd like to take a point going back to Simon Hudson and standards. He's wondering if standards will help to elevate the perception of the management consultancy firm, as opposed to the independent consultants. And also we might see an explosion of independent consultants given this great resignation wake. And Harvey Wade is also interested in how do smaller consultants compete with the larger players? Is it niche, expertise, pricing, a mix? So I think there is a question here as to whether or not your excellence in consulting is about individuals or firms. And I think there's also a thing here about what are its potential effects on competition.
Indeed, yes. Particularly, it's a comment that's been made around the chartered management consultant qualification, and I'm not taking a pop at that because I think broadly it's a great thing to have more recognized qualifications. But a cynic might argue that large firms are embracing it now because they see it as a kind of something they can invest in for their people that will actually freeze out the independents who typically are cheaper and typically have more deep niche expertise. It's an ongoing question within the centre that we're addressing that we'll pick up as we start to unpack the whole professional standards area, particularly as a lot of our members are independents.
Matthew Leach wonders, and I think this you kind of tipped your hat to it with your Hilbert Dilbert, how much of management jargon and buzz phrases contributed to making consultants seem at times ridiculous, because obviously they're very close to that zone. Bob McDowell is curious, how much management consultancy is in effect glorified subcontracting of projects, tasks, and processes? And I must say here, I have a great sympathy, because when you look at the amount of management consultancy in the public sector, it's roughly double what it ought to be on a straight economic basis as a percentage of the economy. Any thoughts there?
I think there is a large amount of, sorry, I've lost the thread of the question there, Michael. Just talking about the kind of the contracting, outsourcing arena, and I think that's the bulk of the growth that we're seeing. I think if you look up a relatively new initiative from Deloitte called Deloitte Converge, and if you can unpack the management jargon from that, which is tricky enough, then you'll see that consultancies are increasingly moving into these. Converge is obviously an intentional term, the sort of converged services where there's a bit of consulting and an outsourced cloud-based platform, the basis for automation. It's not wrong because there's clearly a need to do that, but I think it's incumbent upon clients to be really clear about where they're getting independent advice and where they're getting execution, or maybe a result of that advice, and for consultants to be really clear about that. I mean, in the financial world, this is the Financial Services Club, we have independent financial advisors. I have one who is, as far as I can tell, properly independent, but you have tied advisors who will be quite explicit. They're only advising on the products that they are tied to. So if the financial world can be clear about that to the benefit of their customers, I don't see why consultants can't be a bit clearer than they are at the moment. But I'm also guilty of having used lots and lots of management jargon in the past. I atoned for it by being a head of strategy in the customer contact center area in BT, and wrote a weekly column, or weekly monthly, I can't remember, in the staff newspaper, which explained what we meant by some of these terms like agility and so on. That was a penance, because when I presented a paper, people say, well, we just don't understand it, Nick. So there's nothing better than being told that you're talking absolute rubbish for a consultant.
Yeah, I remember there was a small series we tried to run in the Strategic Planning Society, which is called Meet the Consultants. Meet the Strategists, and it was there to try and force strategists to address really simple problems. Well, look, it's been a fascinating discussion, and sadly, I have to bring it to a close. Folks, Nick has actually put a challenge out there, and you can reach him easily. So please do throw in the questions and comments. All the questions and comments you've put in here will be sent to Nick with your email attached, and he may well get back to you on a few of them. Nick, your story of your son reminds me of a story I had, which is my daughter was when she was about 5, had one of those days where she had to present what Daddy did, but she didn't tell Daddy that she was doing it. So she just went in knowing exactly. And this is where being a member of a livery company was very, very helpful, because she had no idea what I did. But I was a member of a livery company, and she went in and proudly proclaimed to her class that my daddy is a world trader. And that seemed to satisfy everyone. So
Yeah.
I think in some way you almost start in the right sense. We need to have a way in which 5-year-olds can explain what a management consultant is, and everybody sort of gets it. Well, look, it's been really super. A quick round of thanks, obviously, to the audience. You've been very vibrant today, and we appreciate it. To our sponsors, who, as ever, allow us to range widely and freely. And I think one of the tests here would be, whether or not all of our sponsors have, in some sense, a formal employment almost of a management consultant. You'd kind of see that as something. If boards actually said we had somebody definitely in charge of our consultancy, and we had to we had to purchase some consultancy every year, that would be a great indicator that this was a useful profession. And finally, we've got a set of slides of some of our forthcoming events, but as ever, just check out the website. However, my sincerest thanks have to go to you, Nick. You've been open and candid in a way that I think is just so refreshing. I totally admire a project which is getting back to the real basics and is cutting through a lot of the marketing jargon as well as the consultancy jargon. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I'm afraid I have a piece of technology here from a medieval Korean monastery. And that's our Korean karmic clapper, which I'm afraid I'll have to do for opening the floodgates of applause.
Thank you very much. It's been great fun. Thanks all.
Hopefully we'll hear more about the center as it develops. Thank you.